This is The Corner Series, a McGuireWoods series exploring business and legal issues prevalent in today's private equity industry. Tune in with McGuireWoods partner Geoff Cockrell as he and specialists share real-world insight to help enhance your knowledge.
Thank you for joining another episode of The Corner Series. I'm your host, Geoff Cockrell, partner at McGuireWoods. Here at The Corner Series, we try to bring together deal makers and thought leaders at the intersection of private equity and healthcare. And we cover lots of different sectors, lots of different topics. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Adam Abramowitz. He's a managing director at Intrepid Investment Bankers, a boutique investment banking firm that specializes in healthcare transactions. We're going to talk a bit about different dynamics in behavioral sector, which is a pretty expansive sector and one of a ton of interest. But before we jump into some questions, Adam, maybe give an introduction of yourself and Intrepid.
Sure. Thanks, Geoff. Great to be here with you and big fan of the podcast here. Love working with you and the McGuireWoods team. So I am one of the co-founders and managing directors here at Intrepid Investment Bankers. My partners and I started Intrepid in 2010. We all had worked together at a prior firm that dates back to the early 1980s called Barrington Associates. I'll spare you the long, gory details on that situation, but my partners and I left in 2010 to start Intrepid. Me personally, I've been in the M&A advisory business in one shape or another since the late 1990s, grew up at our predecessor firm, and then when the opportunity to come start Intrepid came up, I jumped at it. And today at Intrepid, we focus on M&A advisory, capital raising. We have a growing special situations practice as well too. And across the firm, we have about 100 bankers and offices across the country. And I lead our firm's healthcare and life sciences practices. And one of the things that's most fun for me is, we have a pretty broad-based healthcare practice, maybe similar to you, Geoff. We go where the action is, but there's a few different sub-verticals where we're spending more and more time, one of which is around the behavioral and mental healthcare space, which is particularly interesting for me.
So behavioral investing, people talk about it like it's one sector, but it's really kind of a bunch of different things that are somewhat related. When you think about behavioral as a broad sector, how do you segment it into different kind of components?
Great question, Geoff. So I think none of this is perfectly set in stone, but at least the way me and my team think about it, I think you have folks in maybe the substance abuse disorder space, SUD, and that can take a few different forms with different types of inpatient treatment or residential treatment or outpatient treatment. And going one step further, you're seeing more and more what's called medication-assisted therapies within the substance abuse space. People are realizing that there's other alternatives to just a 12-step abstinence-based program. So you've got sort of the SUD subvertical. Then I think you have more broadly the mental health subvertical, and that could be talk therapy or medication management to deal with mental health issues outside of substance abuse, like anxiety or depression is another area. And there's a lot of technology and new innovations coming into that sector as well too, with whether it's telehealth models focused on mental health, or a couple years ago, I sold a business that offered a service called transcranial magnetic stimulation, which was pretty interesting, focused on mental health. And then another vertical that we spend time in would be around children on the autism spectrum, providing applied behavioral analysis or ABA therapies. And there's been quite a bit of investment and acquisition activity in around the ABA services space. And then finally, which maybe this is a little bit tangential, but providing services into folks with in the intellectually and developmentally disabled population or IDD population is sort of also has some touch points in around the behavioral mental health space.
Maybe talking about some of those subsectors separately, if you think about the kind of the SUD arena, what are some of the drivers / tailwinds in that arena? And then let's talk a little bit about some of the headwinds in that arena.
Sure. So in terms of the drivers, unfortunately, substance abuse continues to be a massive issue across society. It affects people from all walks of life, from the celebrities you see on the front page of the newspaper to those in the underserved communities and everywhere in between. And you need programming to help people across the economy. And I think there's far too few people that have access to, when they have substance abuse issues where they need to get access to care. In some communities, it can be hard to get access to a patient bed or a service provider to get you the help that you need. So there's a lot of, I think, unmet demand and growing demand in the space for sure. I think in terms of some of the challenges in the space, insurance companies often can be difficult to work with across healthcare, and I would say SUD is no different. And I think there's always this push and pull in terms of the authorized length of stay that a patient or individual can get access to. And again, I'm not a clinician, but what I often hear is that the longer the stay or the longer the treatment, the better the outcomes can be. But I think sometimes you're seeing the payers push back on the length of stay, which can be a bit of a challenge. Another interesting trend that we're seeing is while certainly a lot of the industry grew up with residential or inpatient models, I think you're seeing some newer models, whether there may be outpatient models where people will go to day programs, what's called a partial hospitalization program. They're getting a lot more attention these days, or what's called an intensive outpatient program or IOP, where people may go after work or after school 3 to 4 hours a day. And so I think some of these new innovative models are getting more and more attention. And then, in terms of a broader tailwind as well, Geoff, something I'd highlight would be just the use of medication assisted treatment, where I think people are, there's a lot more pharmacological innovations in the marketplace right now, and people realizing, hey, I'm not sure I need to go on this alone and use an abstinence-based program. And so thinking about, hey, can I get some medication-assisted therapy to assist in my recovery journey?
Yeah, and there's other things that are kind of partial tailwinds, but also can be partial headwinds. One area where we are often asked to look at is in the context of testing and try to evaluate whether or not an individual is compliant with the program. Those testing protocols can come under scrutiny, but can also be a significant area of revenue for a business that once you get to a certain scale, you can kind of internalize some of those testing functions. How do you think about some of those dynamics?
Great. Yeah. Look, I think some of the toxicology testing or drug monitoring testing, certainly there's a real important clinical need for it. I think the providers that I work with and speak to tend to have a higher bar in terms of providing those services in-house today. I think just given some of the regulatory landscape that you just mentioned, I mean, you probably might know better than I, but I know there's can be some heightened regulatory scrutiny when you bring those capabilities in-house. And so oftentimes what I'm seeing more and more is people outsourcing that to specialty labs, maybe to not be in the front and center of potentially the regulatory crosshairs. I'm curious, is that something that you've encountered, Geoff?
It's mixed. If done properly, it can be a real value add to the business, both clinically and the ability to be kind of nimble and do enough testing to be effective. But with lots of, like similar to other areas, when there's not a natural constraint on the amount of tests that you order, utilization can always be a pressure point that is a focus both of kind of medical necessity and kind of reimbursement/enforcement. So while it can be beneficial and also lucrative to kind of internalize some of those functions, it's definitely an area where you need to take care.
Sure. Well, one area where we've seen some innovation has been in this area, what's called pharmacogenetics, where a testing provider can analyze a patient's DNA and determine how well they might process or metabolize a drug to make sure that they're getting the right drugs. And I think you're seeing some of that happen more here, where someone may be taking a mental health therapeutic and realizing it's not getting the desired effect. And so some of these advanced genetic testing are also seeing some benefits in and around this market as well.
Like many sectors, there's an increased focus on kind of looking down the timeline of kind of consolidation and growth, with the question being, okay, if this business gets very large, who is the buyer of that? Is it a candidate for an IPO? Because if picture at that stage is murky or not good, that ripples backwards on the consolidation ideas. How do you think of kind of larger upmarket buyers of an SUD type business? Is it better as a standalone? Is it better being bought into a broader organization? Who are the ultimate large buyers?
One of the dynamics and things that I really like about behavioral health is that you don't necessarily deal with some of the compensation scrape adjustments you have in physician practice deals or percentage of collection adjustments you have that can make it difficult to scale with the business or trade to a much larger buyer where sometimes the physicians can have a lot more power than a large investor or buyer may want to see. And some of those models can be difficult to take public. But for example, there's a handful of some larger strategic buyers that have been acquisitive, like an Acadia Healthcare that's publicly traded, or a business called Universal Health Services, UHS, that operates mental health facilities and behavioral health facilities across the country. So those are two folks that are out there, looking at deals and acquiring deals. And then, of course, I don't think any healthcare conversation can be complete without talking about United Healthcare and Optum. They made a big splash a couple years ago buying a large business called Refresh Mental Health that was formerly private equity backed. So I think there certainly are some bigger strategic buyers out there. And then I think there's certainly no shortage of larger private equity sponsors that are attracted to this space and see an opportunity to just help this underserved population where I think there's something like almost half of people that have mental health or SUD issues aren't getting the services that they fully need. And so there's, I think, a fairly deep universe of private equity firms that want to invest or back these types of behavioral health companies.
Let's flip to the other end of the spectrum, the original earlier sellers. I know you work with a lot of founder-owned businesses and taking them to market for an institutional sale for the first time. In the SUD arena in particular, the founders can be colorful, whether that is very much a thing, and it's I guess a natural idea that many of the founders have themselves suffered with some form of addiction. That's why they got into the business in the first place. You can have other sorts of missional driven sellers, sometimes even a not-for-profit. In this kind of subsector, how do you think about the original founder sellers?
First off, I love working with founders and family-owned companies because I think their passion is in it. To your point, a lot of them are mission driven, right? And so you want to make sure that they're first and foremost, they're like hearts in the right place, right? I think, this sector isn't immune from, other sectors where people maybe are just, trying to make a play for cash. So first and foremost, you want to, I like the fact sometimes that maybe people are in recovery because it really shows that they're mission driven. What that leads to often from the buyer's perspective is maybe a bit of a heightened bar because these aren't your proverbial typical former private equity folks or MBA types, right? And so I think the scrutiny for making sure that they have appropriate business practices, the right back-end infrastructure and billing and collections and the systems, and then certainly, where you all get involved from a regulatory and compliance standpoint to make sure they're doing everything appropriately on that front is really critical. But, we love working with the founders, entrepreneurs, because their passion is there, and often they have unique ideas or approaches to the market, to help more patients. So I think what buyers are really looking for is certainly someone that has a strong clinical program where they're getting referrals from other clinicians in the community or other programs in the community, because that can be a really nice stamp of credibility. And then I think, going a few steps further, making sure that they have the right back office infrastructure. And, sometimes we might get introduced to a founder entrepreneur business and it feels like they maybe have a great clinical program, but everything in the back office is done on a shoestring or, with duct tape holding everything together. And that's obviously not as desirable from a private equity or strategic investing standpoint because they want to make sure that a business can be scalable. And I think one of the things we love to do is get to know entrepreneurs as they're building the company. It could be years before they are ready to transact. And that way we can give them some little nuggets of wisdom, hopefully along their journey, and say, hey, you should be thinking about building more of the company infrastructure, or what are you doing in terms of your billing and collections internally, or do you have the right regulatory framework set up? Are you working with top tier lawyers to make sure that you're doing everything in a compliant manner so that when they are ready to think about taking on an investment partner or selling, they're in a great position to do so.
Adam, there was a time when more of those businesses were a little bit more sketch, for lack of a better word, with heavy out-of-network reimbursement, questionable patient procurement practices. I think that the industry is better now. How would you describe some of those evolutions?
Yeah, I think the industry has gone through a lot of changes over the last decade plus, where, to your point, historically, a lot of these were maybe cash pay businesses. I've had some clients where, celebrities and executives would show up in the middle of the night with bags full of cash to get into some of these addiction treatment programs. But the industry has certainly come a long way from there. And then to your point, the industry moved more towards out of network reimbursement, and today, the standard or what investors are looking for is in network insurance reimbursement or with Medicare or Medicaid programs. And so, if a provider has a heavy mix of out of network reimbursement, that could be, a nice business practice for them, but it makes it very hard to transact with an institutional investor if your out of network reimbursement is maybe more than 15, 20, 30% of your revenue, because that can lead to some unpredictable reimbursement and how the payers will respond to the bills you're sending them every month. And so, investors and buyers really want to see that in-network reimbursement, and with a real strong focus on making sure you're billing appropriately and billing all the appropriate codes and not doing anything sketchy, as you might determine.
Maybe shifting to kind of broader mental health businesses, which again can take a lot of different forms, whether that's on one end, kind of psychiatric hospitals. On the other end, you might have just like straight talk therapy or even telehealth. How do you think about kind of that segment and what are some of the drivers within it?
Sure. Yeah, look, I mean, mental illness is just getting a lot more awareness, right? I think especially coming out of COVID, people, I think, are focusing more and more on their mental health, and it's becoming as important as their physical health. And then I think going one step further, the perceived stigma of saying, hey, I'm on medication for my mental health issues, or I'm going to see a clinician to talk about my mental health issues. With those barriers, I think, breaking down, it's just creating a lot more growth and demand for the mental health space. And there's all different levels of care, as you mentioned, Jeff. So we have relationships with companies that operate what I might call like ER, emergency room diversion programs, where if an individual shows up to an emergency room with mental health issues where they're unstable, but maybe they don't have any physical health issues, we're seeing programs pop up where they can, these individuals can go for, 5, 10, 15 days to get stabilized and then go to other levels of care. We're also seeing on the other end of the spectrum a lot more outpatient talk therapy or medication management programs pop up where people want to get access to care, but they want it on their own terms. It could be telehealth, or maybe I pop in more of what looks like a retail-based health clinic. So I think you're seeing growth across the spectrum, and I think the industry broadly is trying to meet patients more where they are, right? Whether they're showing up at an ER or they're high functioning and have a job or go to school, but they still need some help. Really trying to make sure they find the right solution for the right patient wherever he or she is in their respective journey.
And for a lot of those businesses over the last, let's call it 10 years, there's been increasing reimbursement available, which has driven a lot of activity, whether that is kind of parity requirements that require payers to pay the same for mental health that they do for medical surgical help, or just kind of raw dollars becoming available through state programs. There's been a lot more money pointed at some of these problems that kind of, in my mind, created a lot of open green space for people to develop. And of course, people did. Where in that cycle do you think we are? Because at some point, markets can get saturated. What does that look like to your eye?
Yeah, I have to believe we're still in the early to middle innings. I don't feel like this is similar to other sectors of healthcare where there's been a tremendous amount of consolidation. I think certainly there has been private equity activity and strategic buyer activity, but I was just out at a behavioral health conference a week and a half ago and met a lot of smaller fragmented providers that are looking to scale up and grow. And to one of the points I mentioned earlier, there's such a unmet demand out there, and maybe you and I are in big major cities, right, where it can be easy to get care. If you're in an exurb or in a rural area, sometimes it can be very hard to get the care that you need. And so I got to believe we're in the middle innings of opportunity here for people to scale up and provide more programs on the mental health side to help more patients. And then also from a investing standpoint, I think private equity firms, they've seen a number of deals already in this space come across their desk. And I think they're probably being more discerning about what they're looking for in terms of where they want to deploy their capital.
It's interesting you mention outer suburb and rural challenges of healthcare delivery. It's always interesting being out at JP Morgan when you're talking to folks about kind of what they're looking at. That's interesting. But also hearing some of their kind of broader investment thesis, it's very telling to see how people are thinking. And that is one of the unifying themes that I heard, is that regardless of whether you're talking mental health or other sorts of healthcare delivery, if you can find a way to efficiently deliver healthcare into some of those underserved areas, you kind of overcome some of the challenges that private equity investing in healthcare has more generally, meaning, are you really advancing the triple aims of improving access, outcomes, and cost? But having a successful strategy in some of those rural markets really does address all those things. And so there's a ton of focus from kind of almost everyone that I talk to of trying to find ways to deliver care in more difficult to deliver areas. So that's definitely a unifying theme that we see a lot.
100% agree. And I think, if you can solve that equation where if you can do it in an economically viable manner, if it's sort of like, if you build it, they will come, right? Because I've encountered clients where they're building clinics to help children with autism and providing ABA therapy. And some of these families maybe had to drive like an hour or two every day to get access to services. But if you can build a clinic or find a way to deliver services in their community, it can certainly be a real home run. And I think maybe less so in the autism services space, but like technology and telehealth, I think is a great way to do that, where maybe someone only has to go visit a provider every so often, and then they can do follow-up visits via telehealth, especially in around the mental health space. And I think you're seeing a lot more activity or interest to find models like that.
We've only scratched the surface of different mental health and other behavioral categories, but I think we've run out of time. Let's wrap it there. I really appreciate you spending a little time with me. It's a super interesting topic, and I think it's going to be an active sector for some time to come.
For sure, Geoff. This was a lot of fun, and I agree with you, and definitely eager to see how the industry continues to grow and evolve. So it's going to be pretty exciting.
Thank you for joining us on this installment of the Corner Series. To learn more about today's discussion, please email host Geoff Cockrell at gcockrell@McGuireWoods.com. We look forward to hearing from you. This series was recorded and is being made available by McGuireWoods for informational purposes only. By accessing this series, you acknowledge that McGuireWoods makes no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this installment. The views, information, or opinions expressed are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily reflect those of McGuireWoods. This series should not be used as a substitute for competent legal advice from a licensed professional attorney in your state and should not be construed as an offer to make or consider any investment or course of action.